everyone. I am Kim Snyder, and thank you so much for joining me for the Sane Crypto Podcast, the first cryptocurrency podcast for baby boomers investing for retirement. Most people believe that crypto assets are too risky for the average investor. I believe that the risk is in not investing, that in fact cryptocurrency may be the answer to near retirees' prayers, but that the trick is to structure our investment so that if the naysayers are right, we don't do irreparable harm to our nest egg, but if the believers are right, we make potentially life-changing money that could catapult us across that retirement finish line. The Sane Crypto Mastermind is my signature program for those who want cryptocurrency-type returns, but can't, won't, or don't have time to figure this stuff all out on their own and keep up with it. If you'd like to learn more, I'd encourage you to join my free online training, which is how a little bit of Bitcoin can make your retirement savings go a lot further at sanecrypto.com/retirement. I was looking at the Q&A site, Quora, the other day, and a very common question around cryptocurrency is something along the lines of, what is your best cryptocurrency investing advice? And the answers being given were, pretty much your standard fare. Things like hodl, never hodl, take profits, don't invest more than you can afford to lose, doing lots of research, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. Mine is control your lizard brain. If you can't do that, then nothing else will matter. So I decided to go to the wayback machine and dust off an interview I did with Terry Burnham, author of Mean Markets and Lizard Brains, for my radio show all the way back in 2005. Now, being an interview from 2005, obviously, Bitcoin wasn't even a glimmer in Satoshi Nakamoto's eye yet. But everything that we say about the stock market in the interview is equally applicable to crypto assets, since, as I keep reminding you, just because crypto is a new asset class, all the same rules of investing still apply. Just to give you a little background on Terry Burnham is a leader in the application of biology to economics and finance. He was an economics professor at Harvard for many years, beginning at the Kennedy School and then the Harvard Business School. His biological research has taken him to Africa to observe wild chimpanzees and to the laboratory to study the role of testosterone in negotiation. He is co-author of the international bestseller Mean Genes. Before joining the Harvard faculty, he worked at Goldman Sachs and was the president and CFO of a successful startup biotech firm. Now, unfortunately, our technology for recording interviews back in the day wasn't anything like what it is today. It's not horrible, but I'll just apologize in advance for the sound quality. Keep that in mind. So, Terry Burnham, welcome to the show. I am really intrigued by your background because it is so diverse. So just out of curiosity, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I've had a lot of different careers, and I think I always, when I talk to young people in high school, I tell them not to do what I did because I've had a lot of different segments of my life. So I originally was going to be pre-med when I was younger, so I have a lot of science background. My degree's in biophysics. And then I spent about 5 years as a computer science guy working for various military-type folks out in California, doing all kinds of tracking Soviet submarines and that kind of stuff using interesting cryptographic and other instruments. And then I wanted to be a finance guy, and I came back to Cambridge, which is right down the street from where I live now, and went to MIT, to the Sloan School, and majored in finance. And I went to Wall Street for the summer, worked for Goldman Sachs. This was the summer before the big crash and in '87. And while I was there for the summer, I ran into one of my old college buddies, and we ran a biotechnology firm. So instead of going to Wall Street, I became an entrepreneur and did that for about 5 years. And then I came back to school to get my PhD at Harvard in economics, and kind of found an interesting home where my study of economics and finance involves all that science background. So my undergraduate degree is in biophysics, and I was a scientist for a long time, and my company was a biotechnology company. And my research in economics and finance is on the biology of economic behavior. So it all sort of came together into an interesting endpoint, or an endpoint, midpoint, I guess, where I am now.
If you think about the schools of economics, you've got the Chicago School, which is the efficient market guys, and then you've got the behavioral finance guys like Daniel Kahneman. But you're at some sort of very unique intersection of both of those with your own twists thrown in, right?
I think of myself as a biological economist, and I think you're absolutely right. Out of 100 economists, there are probably 90 are mainstream conventional people, which deal with assumptions that people and markets are rational, and then 9 or 9.9 of the 100 are behavioralists who believe that people and markets can both be crazy. And then there's just under 10 people, I think, who really are professors or leading people who are thinking about why we might be crazy in some situations and not crazy. So my my thesis advisor, Vernon Smith, who's now at George Mason, won the Nobel Prize with Andy Kahneman in 2002, and he's, I don't know if he calls himself a biological economist, but he certainly thinks very broadly about why people are the way we are and what the physical basis is of our craziness. And there's a few other people around who think that way. And it really is a reconciliation of the two other schools that says human nature contains both these elements, and it's not correct to say that we're either rational or irrational, but rather that we can be one or the other depending on the circumstances.
And those two competing behavioral types, for lack of a better word, are actually represented by two physical parts of our brain, right?
Oh, within ourselves, yes. I think that's right. So I think that within economics, they go by the name sort of mainstream, would be the rational school, and behavioral. And when you look inside the brain, you can actually see a war going on, and there's a kind of a small part of your brain right above your eyes, can extend all the way back to the ears, called the prefrontal cortex, and it's part of the rational parts of your analysis. So whenever you think about something, and you really try to think about, say, quantitatively, what's the price-to-earnings ratio of a stock, or is a house overvalued, and you think about it in an analytic way, that kind of activity is going on in the front of your brain. When you get scared, if a stock you own is plummeting down in price, and you get terrified and you want to sell it, you feel sick, that's not the front of your brain that's working. That's the back of the brain. Similarly, when you get excited when stocks are going crazy, they're going up every day, and you feel like this urge to buy, and your palms are sweating, got to get in there. That's also the back of the brain, and sort of the vast majority of the brain is not rational, cognitive, analytic, and it has lots of different subparts there. I call it the lizard brain as a summary because it does share some structure with other animals, but I think the term is used more to capture the idea that there's animalistic, non-rational side to our behavior.
So that gives us the perfect segue into the title of your book, Mean Markets and Lizard Brains. What does it mean?
Well, let's take it down into two parts. So the lizard brain part is the non-rational, the less rational, more emotional side of investing. And what's interesting is that it is exactly not your friend in financial markets. So, your intuitive, your emotional side is very helpful in some settings. It might give you a great feel when you meet someone, whether they're an honest person or not an honest person. In financial markets, it turns out that our emotional side is our enemy. And so the reason that I call the book Mean Markets is because if you use your non-intuitive, your intuitive and your emotional sides and lizard brain to make financial investments, you will be always on the wrong side of investments. So we're built to want to buy stocks after they have gone up, and we're built to want to sell stocks after they've gone down, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Same thing with all other assets. Housing market's doing great. It makes us want to get in there, and if you allow yourself to be undisciplined and to use this emotional side of your brain, you will have very bad outcomes. So they're mean markets. Their markets have a tendency to be mean and disappointing because if you do what comes natural to you, you'll end up being very poor.
Okay. So this idea that your emotions, your lizard brain, will always have you on the wrong side of a financial transaction. Can you just talk very briefly about, what is it in our programming specifically that causes us to do that? Like, how does that work?
Well, maybe we can talk about two parts of that. So first, let's talk about just how out of sync people are. So if you can do this both by looking at the overall statistics of where people have their money invested, or you can look actually inside individuals' accounts and see. So if you look at the big picture and you ask, well, are people pretty good at timing their investments? The answer is no, we're terrible as a class. So in 1982, the stock market was considerably under 1,000. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was 875 in 1981. It was about to go up by a factor of 10, one of the biggest bull markets in the history of the world. Stocks, by any sort of measure, were really cheap. You could buy great companies with price-to-earnings ratios of maybe 5, 7. And so you think, well, boy, were Americans excited about owning stocks back when they were cheap at 875 in the Dow? Answer, absolutely not. We had almost none of our money. Under 10% of our wealth was allocated to stocks as individuals back in 1981. By the time the stock market peaked, at least for a while, in 2000, we had about almost 70% of our wealth in stocks. So we were completely out of sync, meaning when stocks were a great buy, we didn't own any of them as a group, and when stocks were overvalued and ridiculously priced, we owned all of them. More recently, people have done research where they've looked right into the individual accounts, and they have found that whenever people make emotional trades, they've done a study of 10,000 individual investors, and they said, okay, well, let's say Kim buys a stock today and sells another stock to pay for her purchase. And then they look at the two stocks and see how they did over the next year. They found out that the stock that you bought did terribly, and the stock that you sold did great. And this isn't, anecdote. This is actually systematically looking at people's investments and seeing that, hey, guess what? We are not very good at being on the right side of investments.
All right, taking off from that idea, when one reads your book, you seem to suggest that, the prescription is just reducing risk. Is that how you would boil it down?
Well, what I say is that I know, by understanding how the lizard brain works, I know which way people will be wrong in their investments. So it's kind of like saying, if you're trying to hit the curveball, it's going to curve away from you more than you expect. So it's not per se that you have a doom and gloom attitude about the real economy. I'm tremendously impressed by the productivity improvements in the U.S. economy. But nevertheless, what I believe is that we've all been fooled into thinking that the world is less risky than it is. And when I was in the Marine Corps, and before I went to boot camp, this guy that I work with came up to me and said, Terry, boot camp is going to be 10 times harder than you think. And I said to him, but Bill, you don't know how hard I think boot camp's going to be. He goes, I know that you're wrong by at least a factor of 10. So then I was in boot camp, and I kept thinking, how could he know whether I was optimistic or not? And then every day I was there and I was miserable. I kept thinking, well, he really was smart. It is 10 times worse than I thought. So in the same way, because I understand how the lizard brain works and how the past generation of returns has messed with our instinctual systems, I know that whatever level of risk an investor believes is appropriate for them, the actual appropriate level is far less than that. So almost every single person I know ought to have less risk than they feel is appropriate. So if I ask you, I start off in my book with a former student of mine, Adam, who has 60% of his wealth invested in stocks, and I say you should cut that at least by half and maybe by three-quarters, because his assessment of the right level of risk is biased because his brain's been basically messed up with this unusual and fantastic generation that we've lived through.
Hey, y'all. 2018 Kim here, jumping in from the editing booth. Just so you know, I have been recommending this book for a very, very long time. After this interview, Terry and I became acquaintances. I'm pretty sure he wrote one of the blurbs for my book. Not 100% sure about that, but I'm pretty sure he did. And, we had lunches and things where we talked about these things. And one of the areas where we diverge is on this idea of risk. Terry, as you have heard and will hear, is very much has this idea that we don't, we've been tricked, we take too much risk. I, on the other hand, go in a completely opposite direction. I think what a lot of people mistake for risk, things like volatility is not risk, for example. They misunderstand risk on the one hand, and even more importantly, that I think people need to take more risk in many cases, although not crazy risk, but in order to, because risk reward is the return for risk, right? And so the only way to be able to afford to live 40 plus years in retirement, now potentially 50, 60 years in retirement on your life savings, you are going to need these sorts of returns that are only gotten by taking risk. Profit is a reward for risk. And you ratchet your portfolio down to 10% stocks, it will never work. Never. It's got to be closer to 100%, in fact, in my view. So that's an area where we intellectually and, spiritedly disagree, which is fine. But I just wanted to make you aware of that as this goes on. Now, on the other hand, I will say Terry was quite instrumental in cementing my thinking around the need for systems, which is something that I did naturally, but he really, really helped me with my thinking about constructing very hard and fast systems around our behavior so that our lizard brain couldn't mess things up. So on that front, which you'll talk about here in a second, we are complete and total agreement. So anyway, I just wanted to jump in and clarify that. So with that, back to the interview.
Well, I think the big picture, first of all, though, is, mainly we've talked about how humans are messed up. We have this lizard brain. We have a part of our brain which is really bad at making these sorts of decisions. And if they're, mean markets are mean if you allow your emotions to drive your investment plan. You're not built for navigating these worlds, and you can't. What we haven't talked about very much is that the rational part of our brains is far bigger than any other animal. So if we have any hope, what we have to do is use the rational part of our brain. And I think it's twofold. Number one is you really have to come to grips with the fact that your brain is systematically wrong right now in estimating risk, so that the right level of risk is going to be more conservative than you feel. Number two is understanding that is knowing how hard it is going to be to implement it, because as I detail at quite some length in the book, the influence of the lizard brain on our behavior is hidden from us, and so we have to be pretty crafty in the way that we rein it in. So if you just think, and again, all you have to do is think about other behaviors besides finance. If you think you can sit down in front of a plate of French fries and not eat one, you haven't got the same kind of lizard brain I have. And so we often think in the abstract that we're going to be able to achieve our goals through willpower and discipline. We're just going to be tough. We're going to work out every day. We're not going to smoke cigarettes. We're going to eat good foods. But we have to be very careful in the situations we put ourselves in, because at the end of the day we might not have the willpower we need to execute those things. So the fundamental insight to all the tips I give within the book is you can't rely on willpower. You have to structure a world where your emotions cannot get at your investment accounts. And the steps I have listed there to reduce your allocation to stocks, to own a smaller home than you want to own, and so forth, really all fall underneath that heading, though, of knowing yourself. And that really is the sort of most positive message in the book, which is understanding your own mistakes and then trying to structure your investment world to use discipline and not emotion will allow you to achieve all of those individual steps, which all fall underneath that larger framework.
All right, y'all. Hopefully you found that helpful. If so, you can do me a great big favor in return, which is one, to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss a single episode, and two, leave me a 5-star rating and a review with comments and feedback. And the reason is that feeds the great iTunes algorithm gods. The more engagement that you get with the show, the more comments and ratings and subscribes we get, the more people iTunes will show it to. The less engagement we get, the less subscribes. On a percentage basis, they just stick it into some big old podcast black hole. So if you would like to learn more about my system of investing in crypto assets for retirement while controlling your lizard brain, I would recommend my free online training, how a little bit of Bitcoin can make your retirement savings go a lot further, at sanecrypto.com/retirement. You can get the full show notes of this episode at sanecrypto.com/podcast, including links to Terry's book, as well as articles and resources that were mentioned, in case you want to do a deeper dive on any of that. And finally, if you have a question about today's topic or anything else, just email me at askkim@sanecrypto.com. I read and answer every email personally, as well as answer some of them here on the show. Everything I say on this show is for educational purposes only. Nothing should be considered investment advice. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All investments involve risk, so do not, under any circumstances, invest money you can't afford to lose. That is it for me. I am Kim Snyder. I'll be back next week. Until then, may the crypto gods continue to smile on us all.